Have you ever found yourself caught between the past and the future? Between love and loyalty? What happens when the heart leads you down a path that challenges everything you thought you knew? In today's story, we explore the quiet struggles, the quiet betrayals, and the moments that redefine everything. Stay with me as we dive deep into a journey of love, regret, and the choices that shape our lives. At 21, she became his irresistible temptation, a millionaire CEO's secret. The unexpected reunion. Julian drove along the winding country road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, as if holding on to the last shred of normalcy in a life that had long since unraveled. It had been 3 months since Eleanor's death, and the world still felt like a place he didn't belong. Each day was the same: work, sleep, repeat. But even the comfort of routine couldn't erase the overwhelming void she left behind. The gravel driveway of the old country house stretched out in front of him like an unspoken invitation, pulling him back to a place he had once found solace in. The Hudson Valley, with its rustic charm and sprawling greenery, had always been a refuge, a sanctuary where Julian could escape the demands of the city, a place where memories of Eleanor seemed both distant and present all at once. The house had been theirs, but now it was just a reminder of what he had lost. The air was cooler here, a slight breeze carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, a smell that used to soothe his weary soul. But today, it felt different, as if even the familiar smells could no longer comfort him. The silence inside the car was almost unbearable, punctuated only by the soft hum of the engine and the occasional crunch of gravel beneath the tires. He parked in front of the house and sat there for a moment, staring at the weathered stone facade. There was a heaviness in his chest, a weight he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the grief, it was something more profound, something he had yet to fully understand. His old friend Silas, the man who had been his closest confidant for over 2 decades, greeted him at the door with a tight hug and a cold beer in hand. Silas was a good man, steady, dependable, the kind of person who didn't need to say much to let you know he was there for you. They had shared countless moments of joy and sorrow over the years, but today, there was something different in the air. "You look thinner," Silas said, stepping back to take in Julian's appearance. His eyes softened with concern. "And you've got dark circles under your eyes that don't lie." Julian forced a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I sleep little. I work too much." Silas didn't buy it. "That's a lie. You're running from your own thoughts. You need silence," he said, handing Julian the beer. Julian accepted it, his fingers brushing the cool glass. They sat on the weathered porch, watching the sun dip behind the Catskill Mountains, casting long shadows across the land. The cool breeze ruffled the trees, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was a peaceful evening, the kind that used to settle his mind, but tonight it only made him feel more alone. "How have you been, Silas?" Julian asked, his voice low, almost reluctant to speak. He wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer, but he asked anyway. Silas took a long sip of his beer before answering. "You know me, Julian. I'm doing all right, but it's been tough, not having her around. I still think I see her sometimes, you know? In the corners of rooms, in the way the light hits things." He paused, his eyes clouding over for a moment. "But I'm surviving." Julian nodded. "I know what you mean. Some days I wake up, and for just a second, I forget she's gone. It's like she's still there, making coffee in the kitchen or telling me to stop working so much. And then the moment passes, and it hits me all over again." The silence between them grew, heavy with the weight of shared grief. Julian couldn't bring himself to speak about Eleanor too much. It hurt too much. Silas understood that. They both sat there, watching the sky darken, not needing to say anything more. After a few moments, Silas changed the subject. "Lyra's back in town," he said, his tone lighter, though there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. "Lyra?" Julian asked, his heart stuttering in his chest. He hadn't seen Lyra in years, not since she was a teenager, running through the house with books under her arm, her curly hair bouncing as she went. She was Silas's daughter, the little girl who used to call him Uncle Julian when she was younger. But now she had to be 21, and Julian could hardly imagine her as anything other than the girl she once was. "Yeah," Silas said. "She finished up her graduate program in Paris. She's different now, she's grown up, and she's been asking about you." Julian didn't know what to say. Lyra was an adult now, a woman, not the bright-eyed teenager he remembered, and something about that thought made him uneasy. It was as if the world he had once known had shifted beneath his feet, and he wasn't sure how to navigate it anymore. "She's different, huh?" Julian muttered, more to himself than to Silas. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face the person Lyra had become. He hadn't even thought about her much, but now her presence seemed inevitable. Silas's eyes darkened slightly, as if he were watching Julian carefully. "I was thinking of suggesting she intern at your firm," he said, his voice casual but with an underlying meaning. Julian froze. "My firm?" The idea caught him off guard. He hadn't considered it. They were close friends, yes, but mixing business and personal life was always risky. And with Lyra, Silas's daughter, he wasn't sure it was a good idea. Silas pressed on. "She's got a degree in architecture, Julian. It'd be a perfect fit. She'd get the experience she needs, and your firm could benefit from her fresh perspective. It's just an idea." Julian hesitated. His gut instinct told him that mixing personal and professional life was never a good idea. But something in Silas's words made him pause. It wasn't just about business. Something else lingered beneath the surface, a feeling he couldn't quite explain. He felt trapped between wanting to help and a growing sense of unease. "I don't know, Silas," Julian said slowly. "I've been trying to keep things simple, after everything that's happened." He trailed off, unsure of how to continue. Silas's expression softened. "Simple or dead, Julian. You can't just keep running from your feelings." The words hit Julian harder than expected. He looked at his friend, surprise and pain flashing across his face. Silas was right, but admitting it made the truth even harder to face. "I'll think about it," Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's see how it goes." As they sat in silence, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something he wasn't ready for. Lyra's return, her presence in the house, and the implications of her working at his firm were all pieces of a puzzle he wasn't sure he could solve. The evening sky darkened further, and the crickets began to chirp, their sound filling the space between them. Julian knew one thing for sure: whatever was coming, he wasn't ready for it. A girl who has grown up. The next morning, Julian awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside his window, their melodies carrying through the thin walls of the country house. It had been a restless night, with his mind consumed by the conversation he had with Silas and the thoughts of Lyra. He couldn't shake the image of her that had formed in his mind, grown up, no longer the awkward, bookish girl he remembered. He got out of bed, rubbed his eyes, and made his way to the kitchen, where the smell of coffee filled the air. Silas was already up, sitting at the counter with a cup of coffee in hand, scrolling through his phone. His calm demeanor was a sharp contrast to the turbulence Julian felt inside. "Morning," Julian muttered, taking a seat beside him. Silas didn't look up from his phone. "Morning. Coffee's on the counter. It's strong." Julian nodded, grabbing the mug and taking a sip. The warmth spread through him, but it didn't do much to quiet his thoughts. He was restless, his mind replaying Silas's words from last night about Lyra. She was different now. She was a woman. The idea unsettled him. He remembered the young girl who would run through the halls of this house, her curly hair bouncing as she laughed. She was bright and eager, full of life and energy. But that girl was long gone. The woman she had become was someone Julian couldn't even begin to fathom. His thoughts were interrupted by a voice from the doorway. "Hey, Uncle Julian." He looked up, his heart skipping a beat. Lyra stood in the doorway, her presence commanding attention. Her long, dark hair framed her face in soft waves, and her eyes, once innocent and wide, were now full of depth. She wore a simple pair of jeans and a white blouse, but there was a natural elegance in the way she carried herself. It wasn't just the clothes, it was her demeanor, the way she moved, the confidence that radiated from her. Julian's breath caught in his throat. She wasn't the girl he remembered. She was someone else entirely. "Hey, Lyra," he said, his voice hoarse. He stood up awkwardly, unsure of what to say. "How do you talk to a woman you've known as a child, but who is now a stranger in your eyes?" She smiled, that familiar, warm smile that still had the power to make his chest tighten. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." No, not at all," Julian said quickly, stepping back from the counter. "Just having some coffee." Lyra's gaze flickered between him and Silas, her father still absorbed in his phone. "I was thinking about going for a walk around the property," she said. "It's so beautiful out here." "That sounds like a good idea," Julian said, his voice betraying his uncertainty. The idea of being alone with her was both thrilling and terrifying, and he wasn't sure he was ready to face that reality. But he didn't want to appear rude, so he forced a smile. "I'll come with you." Lyra's eyes brightened. "Great." She turned toward the door, stepping into the cool morning air, Julian following closely behind. As they walked down the long gravel driveway, the morning fog still clinging to the valley, Julian tried to gather his thoughts. Lyra was the same in some ways, her curiosity, her intelligence, but there was something different about her now. She wasn't just Silas's daughter anymore. She was a woman, and the boundaries between them had shifted in a way Julian didn't know how to navigate. "I love the way the light hits everything in the morning," Lyra said, breaking the silence. "It feels like everything is possible." Julian smiled faintly. "Yeah, it does have a way of making things look different." He didn't know what else to say. He had never been good with words, especially not when it came to matters of the heart. They walked in silence for a few minutes, the sound of their footsteps crunching on the gravel the only noise between them. Julian couldn't help but notice the way Lyra's hair bounced with each step, the way her body seemed so at ease in the space around her. She was confident in a way that was both alluring and intimidating. He had spent so many years seeing her as the little girl he once knew, but now she was someone else, a woman he didn't know how to approach. Lyra stopped near a bench overlooking the valley, her eyes scanning the view. "It's so peaceful out here," she said softly. "I remember coming here with Dad when I was younger. I always felt safe here." Julian sat beside her, not knowing what to say. The quiet was comforting, but it also felt charged, like something was waiting to happen. "I know things have changed," Lyra continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't seen you in years, and I know you've been through a lot. But I wanted to say that I'm really glad you're here, Julian. I think you needed this." Julian swallowed hard. "Yeah, I think I did too." For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply sat there, watching the fog lift from the valley below, the quiet morning stretching on. "Silas told me you were thinking about letting me intern at your firm," Lyra said, her voice steady. "I would really appreciate the opportunity. I've been working hard to get where I am, and I think this could be a good fit for me." Julian's heart skipped a beat. The words felt like a test, but he couldn't quite figure out the meaning behind them. Was this just a professional request, or was there something more to it? He turned toward her, meeting her gaze for the first time since they'd started talking. Her eyes held a quiet intensity that made him feel like she was reading him, as if she knew something he didn't want to admit. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice thick. "It's a big decision, and I'm not sure what's best yet, but I'll let you know." Lyra smiled, her expression warm but tinged with something more. "Thanks, Uncle Julian. I appreciate it." The walk back to the house was quieter, and Julian couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. Lyra wasn't just Silas's daughter anymore. She was a woman who was making her own decisions, and those decisions could very well include him, and that terrified him more than he was willing to admit. As they reached the house, Lyra turned to him, her eyes lingering a moment longer than necessary. "I'm glad we could talk," she said, her voice soft. "I hope we get to know each other better." Julian nodded, but the words caught in his throat. "Yeah," he managed, his heart pounding. "Me too." He watched her walk back into the house, her figure disappearing behind the door, and for the first time in a long while, he felt an unsettling mix of fear and longing. He wasn't sure where this would lead, but something told him that the path ahead was one he couldn't ignore. Part 3. Silas's proposal. Julian didn't sleep well that night. He tossed and turned, his thoughts a jumble of emotions and unresolved tension. The house, which had once been a sanctuary, now felt too large, too empty. The quiet was deafening. His mind kept returning to Lyra, her smile, her eyes, the way she moved with such effortless grace. She was no longer the girl he remembered, and that realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. When the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, Julian gave up on sleep and decided to get up. The kitchen was still and quiet when he made his way downstairs, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the bitter warmth a temporary comfort against the cold thoughts swirling in his mind. Silas was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with his own mug, his gaze distant. He was scanning something on his phone, but he looked up when he heard Julian's footsteps. "Morning," Silas said, his voice steady but with a hint of concern, as if he knew something was weighing on his friend's mind. "Morning," Julian replied, pouring himself a second cup of coffee and sitting down across from him. They sat in silence for a few moments, both lost in their thoughts. Julian wasn't sure what to say. His internal conflict had only deepened since the walk with Lyra. The idea of her interning at his firm had started to feel more like a temptation than a professional opportunity. But that wasn't the only thing gnawing at him. It was the growing awareness of how much Lyra had changed, how much he wanted her to stay the same, and how much that was no longer possible. Finally, Silas broke the silence. "You're thinking about the internship, aren't you?" Julian didn't answer immediately. His mind raced as he tried to process his feelings. He had never been good at separating personal life from work, and now, with Lyra involved, the lines had blurred. He had a responsibility to his firm, yes, but he also had a responsibility to his friendship with Silas. The last thing he wanted to do was complicate things further. "I'm not sure," Julian said finally, his voice quiet. "I don't know if it's a good idea. I mean, professionally, yes, it makes sense. But personally—" He trailed off, unsure of how to put the complexity of his feelings into words. Silas studied him carefully, his expression unreadable. "You're not sure about what? About Lyra? Or about what this might mean for you?" Julian shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Both. I don't know if I can separate the personal from the professional anymore. She's not the same girl I remember, Silas. She's grown up. She's a woman now, and I don't know how to handle that." Silas's gaze softened, and he leaned back in his chair. "I get it. I do. But you need to think about what's best for you, Julian. Not just what's best for your firm, not just what's best for me. What's best for you." Julian looked down at his coffee, his fingers absently tracing the rim of his mug. The weight of Silas's words settled over him, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to consider his own needs, his own desires. The idea of being involved with Lyra, of crossing that line, terrified him. But was that fear enough to stop him from acknowledging what was starting to feel inevitable? "I just don't know what it would do to everything," Julian muttered, more to himself than to Silas. "To the firm, to you, to her. I'm scared of what would happen if things went too far. What if it ruins everything?" Silas didn't respond immediately. He took a long sip from his coffee and studied Julian with a look that was both understanding and challenging. Finally, he spoke. "Maybe you need to take a step back and look at it from a different perspective," Silas suggested. "You're afraid of what could happen, but have you really thought about what's been happening already? You're not living, Julian. You're existing. You've been holding on to Eleanor's memory, and I get that. It's not easy to move on. But maybe it's time to start living again. And maybe Lyra's the one who can help you with that." Julian's chest tightened at the mention of Eleanor. The pain was still fresh, still raw. He had loved Eleanor more than he had loved anyone in his life. Her loss had shattered him in ways he couldn't describe, but Silas was right in one sense. He hadn't truly lived since her death. He had been hiding, running from the possibility of feeling something again. He had been burying himself in work, in routines, in anything that would keep his mind from drifting back to the pain. But now, Lyra was in his life again, and she wasn't just Silas's daughter anymore. She was a woman, her own person, with her own desires, her own ambitions, and the connection between them was undeniable. "You think I'm ready for that?" Julian asked, his voice heavy with doubt. "I've spent so much time trying to keep everything together, trying to keep the pieces from falling apart. And now I don't know if I'm ready to open myself up to something new." Silas's expression softened, and he set his coffee cup down with a sigh. "Julian, life isn't about being ready. It's about taking chances. You've been through hell, and I know it. But you're still here, you're still breathing, and maybe it's time to stop running from what's in front of you." There was a long pause. Julian stared at his friend, feeling the weight of the words sink into his heart. The fear, the guilt, the confusion, it was all still there, lingering beneath the surface. But deep down, he knew Silas was right. Maybe it was time to let go of the past. Maybe it was time to stop hiding from the possibility of love, even if it came in a form he hadn't expected. "I'll think about it," Julian said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "But I need time. I need to figure this out." Silas nodded, giving him a small, knowing smile. "Take all the time you need, Julian. But just remember, sometimes the hardest thing is the right thing." Julian sat in silence, the words echoing in his mind. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in months, he felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark that maybe, just maybe, life wasn't done with him yet. The first spark. The days that followed felt like a blur to Julian. It was as though the world had paused, and he was simply walking through it, unsure of his next step. The conversation with Silas had given him something to think about, but it hadn't provided the clarity he was searching for. He couldn't deny that Lyra was always on his mind, that something was shifting between them, but he wasn't sure how to navigate this new dynamic. One afternoon, as the golden light of late summer filtered through the trees, Julian found himself on the porch with his thoughts again. The house, which had always been a place of refuge, now felt like a cage. He had come here to escape, but instead, he felt more trapped than ever before. The quiet had become unbearable, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. He had spent so much time guarding himself, protecting his heart, and now Lyra's presence was forcing him to confront feelings he wasn't ready to face. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Julian heard footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Lyra walking toward him, her face illuminated by the warm, golden light of the evening. She was alone, her posture confident yet relaxed, the same natural elegance she had always possessed. But now, it was different. There was a weight to her presence, a maturity that Julian couldn't ignore. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice soft but steady, as if she had already sensed the unease between them. Julian gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Of course, I was just thinking." Lyra smiled faintly as she sat down, her eyes scanning the view before settling on Julian. "You seem a million miles away. What's on your mind?" Julian hesitated, unsure of how to answer. He couldn't tell her the truth, not yet. He couldn't admit that his thoughts had been consumed by her, that every moment he spent with her felt like a spark, a connection he wasn't sure he could control. "Just work, you know," Julian said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "Trying to figure things out." Lyra looked at him with a knowing expression, her brow furrowing slightly as if she could see right through the facade he was putting up. "You've been doing a lot of that lately," she said, "trying to figure things out." Julian didn't reply, not sure how to respond. He had always been a man of action, someone who kept his emotions in check, who compartmentalized his life so that nothing ever interfered with his work. But Lyra had a way of breaking through his defenses, of making him feel things he wasn't ready to feel. For a moment, there was silence between them, the only sound the gentle rustle of the leaves in the wind. Julian could feel the tension building, the unspoken words hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. Finally, Lyra spoke again, her voice soft but determined. "Julian, I know things are complicated, but I don't want you to feel like you have to hide from me. I don't want to be someone you avoid." Her words hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't just the fact that she was acknowledging the tension between them. It was the sincerity in her voice, the openness she was offering. For the first time since he had seen her again, Julian felt like she wasn't just Silas's daughter. She was a woman, someone who saw him not as a father figure or a boss, but as a man with his own struggles, his own pain. He turned to her, his heart racing. "It's not that I'm avoiding you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's just complicated. You're Silas's daughter. I'm not sure how to balance all of this." Lyra met his gaze, her eyes unwavering, and for a moment Julian saw something in them that he hadn't expected. Understanding, empathy, and perhaps something more. "I get it," she said softly. "I really do. But you don't have to hide behind that. I'm not a child anymore, Julian. I'm not someone you need to protect or shield from the world." Her words cut through him like a knife. She was right. She wasn't the same girl he remembered. She was an adult, a woman with her own thoughts, her own desires. And yet Julian still saw the child in her, the girl who had once called him Uncle Julian with wide, trusting eyes. How had it happened so quickly? How had he gone from seeing her as a little girl to seeing her as someone who made his heart beat faster, his thoughts more chaotic? "I don't want to make things harder for you," Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know how to stop feeling what I'm feeling." Lyra leaned in slightly, her gaze never leaving his. "You don't have to stop, Julian. You don't have to fight it. We're adults. We can make our own choices." The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, and Julian could feel his pulse quicken. He wasn't sure if it was the proximity, the vulnerability in her voice, or the simple fact that she was no longer a child, but something inside him shifted. There was a spark, a recognition that this wasn't just some fleeting connection. It was something deeper, something that couldn't be ignored. For the first time in weeks, Julian felt alive, the weight of his grief and his guilt momentarily forgotten. The emotions he had buried for so long were bubbling to the surface, and despite his fear, he couldn't help but feel drawn to Lyra in a way that was undeniable. She leaned back in her chair, her expression softening. "I know you're scared," she said, her voice gentle. "But I'm not going anywhere, Julian. And I don't want you to run from what we have." Julian opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was frozen, caught between the past and the present, between the man he was and the man he was becoming. But in that moment, as he looked into Lyra's eyes, he knew one thing for certain. There was no going back. Lyra was no longer a part of his past, she was part of his future. Whether he was ready for it or not, their paths had crossed, and there was no way to untangle the mess of emotions, desires, and regrets that had begun to form between them. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the land, and for a brief moment, everything felt right. In that quiet, fragile moment, Julian realized that he was no longer living in the shadow of his past. He was finally standing on the edge of something new, something terrifying but exhilarating. "Maybe you're right," Julian said, his voice barely audible as he looked at Lyra. "Maybe it's time I stop running." Part 5. A growing tension. The days that followed were a blur for Julian, a mix of unspoken words, stolen glances, and a palpable tension that seemed to hang between him and Lyra. Every time she was near, his heart raced, and his mind struggled to maintain its usual level of composure. The house, once a place of solace, now felt like a pressure cooker, the simmering emotions inside him threatening to boil over. He couldn't seem to avoid her anymore. Every morning, they would meet at the breakfast table, exchanging polite pleasantries, but there was always something in the air, an undercurrent of desire that neither of them knew how to address. The awkwardness of their new dynamic loomed over every interaction, and Julian couldn't tell if it was his own guilt that made him hesitant, or if Lyra was feeling it too. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the yard, Julian found himself in his office, going over blueprints for an upcoming project. He tried to focus, tried to immerse himself in work, but his mind kept drifting to the woman who had been in his thoughts constantly since the day she'd walked into this house. He couldn't help it. Everything about her intrigued him. Her confidence, her intelligence, the way she moved with such natural elegance. It all drew him in, and yet he was terrified of what those feelings might mean. The door to his office creaked open, and Julian looked up to find Lyra standing there, a hesitant expression on her face. She wasn't interrupting anything, but he couldn't help the way his pulse quickened at the sight of her. "Hey," she said softly, her voice almost uncertain. "Hey," Julian replied, trying to steady his breath. He sat up straighter in his chair, momentarily distracted by how close she was. The soft scent of her perfume reached him, a floral fragrance that seemed to cling to his senses. "I was wondering if you had a minute," Lyra said, stepping closer to his desk. "I wanted to ask you something about the project." "Of course," Julian replied, motioning for her to sit. "What's on your mind?" Lyra smiled faintly, though there was something guarded in her expression. "I've been thinking about some of the designs for the new residential project, and I have a few ideas that I think could work. But I wanted to run them by you first." Julian nodded, his mind still lingering on the tension between them. He tried to focus on her words, but her presence was so distracting. It wasn't just the professional conversation, it was the fact that she was so close to him, the unspoken understanding between them growing stronger with each passing day. Lyra pulled out a folder from under her arm and set it down in front of him. She flipped it open, revealing a series of sketches and designs. Julian leaned forward, forcing himself to pay attention, though his heart was still racing. She pointed to one of the sketches, her finger tracing the lines of the design. "I was thinking we could open up the living area a bit more, maybe use some sliding glass doors to let in more natural light. It would make the space feel bigger, more open." Julian nodded, pretending to consider the idea, though his mind kept drifting back to her. There was something so mesmerizing about the way she spoke, the way her eyes sparkled with excitement as she talked about architecture. He could feel himself drawn to her in ways he couldn't explain. Every word she spoke seemed to resonate with him, not just as a colleague, but as something more, a woman who had his full attention. "You've got a good eye," he said, trying to sound professional. "I think this could work. We'll need to review the structural implications, but it's definitely worth exploring." Lyra's face lit up with a smile, but Julian couldn't help but notice the way her eyes lingered on him, as if she were searching for something. It wasn't just about the project anymore. There was an unspoken connection, a spark between them that neither of them could deny. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them hung thick in the air, and Julian could feel his heart racing. He wanted to say something, anything to break the silence, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't sure if he was more afraid of what he wanted or what he didn't want. Finally, Lyra broke the silence. "Julian." Her voice was soft, almost tentative. "Can I ask you something personal?" His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he nodded. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Lyra hesitated, her fingers nervously tapping on the edge of the desk. She seemed to gather her thoughts before speaking again, her eyes meeting his with a vulnerability that made Julian's chest tighten. "Why are you so distant with me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian froze. The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. He had been avoiding this conversation, avoiding the truth of what was happening between them, but now that Lyra had asked, he couldn't run from it any longer. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. I don't mean to be distant. It's just complicated." "Complicated how?" Lyra pressed, her voice steady but her eyes searching. "I can tell something's going on between us, Julian. I know you're not the same with me as you used to be, and I'm not asking for an explanation, but I just want to know why." Julian let out a shaky breath, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as he tried to steady himself. He had never been good at expressing his emotions, especially not when it came to matters of the heart. But with Lyra, everything was different. She made him feel things he didn't understand, things that scared him. "It's not you," he said finally, his voice rough. "It's me. I'm still dealing with everything. With losing Eleanor, with everything that's changed. I've been trying to keep myself together, and I don't know how to let go." Lyra's eyes softened, her expression gentle. You don't have to let go, Julian. You don't have to forget. But you can live again. You deserve that. You deserve to be happy. Her words hit him harder than he expected. They were simple, yet profound, and they seemed to cut through the walls he had built around himself. Julian was silent for a long moment, the weight of her words settling in his chest. I don't know if I'm ready for that, he confessed, his voice barely audible. You don't have to be ready, Lyra said softly. You just have to be willing. Her words hung in the air between them, and for the first time in a long while, Julian felt the stirrings of something he thought he had lost forever, a flicker of hope. Facing the past. The next morning, Julian woke up to the quiet hum of the house, but it felt different. The weight that had settled over him in recent days seemed heavier, pressing against his chest. He had spent most of the night tossing and turning, his thoughts consumed with Lyra and the conversation they had shared the day before. Her words, "You just have to be willing," kept echoing in his mind, and no matter how much he tried to push them away, they lingered. Julian had been running from the past for so long, keeping his grief locked away in the deepest corners of his mind. He had convinced himself that he couldn't move forward, that loving again would somehow be a betrayal to Eleanor's memory. But what if it wasn't? What if Lyra was right, that living, even in the face of grief, was something he deserved? The thought terrified him, but it was also liberating. As he walked down the hallway, he passed the room that had once been theirs, the room where he and Eleanor had shared so many memories. The scent of her still lingered in the air, a mixture of lavender and fresh linen. For a moment, Julian stopped at the door, his hand resting on the doorknob as a wave of sadness washed over him. It felt like yesterday when they had stood there together, laughing, planning for the future. But that future was gone, and the space was now filled with echoes of the past. Julian closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, and as he opened them again, his gaze fell on the photo on the mantelpiece, an old picture of him and Eleanor, their faces full of joy. The picture was a reminder of what he had lost, but also of what he had once had. It was part of him, a part of his heart that would never fade. But that didn't mean he had to remain stuck in it forever. He had to move forward, even if that meant facing the discomfort of change. The sound of footsteps approaching broke his reverie. Julian turned to see Lyra standing in the doorway, her eyes soft and concerned. She had been giving him space in the days following their last conversation, but it seemed that today something had changed. She stepped into the room, her presence a quiet comfort amidst the heavy atmosphere. "Julian," she said softly, her voice tentative, "I know you've been avoiding this room, and I get why. But I also know you don't have to do this alone." Julian swallowed hard. His throat tightened at the sincerity in her voice. He had wanted to avoid confronting the past, to keep it locked away in the corners of his mind. But here was Lyra, standing in front of him, offering him something he hadn't realized he needed, understanding. "I can't let go of her," Julian whispered, his voice hoarse. "I can't forget what we had. It feels like if I move on, I'll be dishonoring her memory." Lyra walked over to him, her footsteps soft, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not dishonoring her, Julian. You're honoring her by living, by allowing yourself to find joy again. She wouldn't want you to live in grief forever. She'd want you to be happy." The words hit Julian like a wave, crashing over him and pulling him into the current of emotions he had been avoiding for so long. He felt the sting of tears welling in his eyes but forced them back, unwilling to show any weakness. His grief was a private matter, one he had carried alone for so long. But in that moment, with Lyra standing beside him, he realized that he didn't have to carry it alone anymore. I don't know how to do this," Julian admitted, his voice trembling. "I've been living in this house, in this memory, for months. I've been avoiding everything that reminds me of her, but now, I don't know how to let go." Lyra's eyes were full of compassion as she nodded. "You don't have to let go all at once, Julian. It's not about forgetting her. It's about finding a way to live with the memory, to find peace in it. Grief doesn't go away, but it changes. It becomes something else, something you can carry with you while still moving forward." Julian's breath hitched as he tried to process her words. He had never thought of it that way. For so long, he had thought that moving forward meant erasing the past, pretending it didn't exist. But Lyra was right. It wasn't about forgetting Eleanor. It was about accepting her place in his life and finding a way to embrace the future, even in the face of pain. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe I need to be." Lyra smiled softly. "You don't have to be ready today or tomorrow. Just take it one step at a time. I'm here, Julian. You don't have to face this on your own." The words sank deep into his chest, settling there like a small seed of hope. For the first time in months, Julian felt like there was a way out of the darkness, a way forward. He didn't have to forget the past to move on. He could carry it with him, honor it, and still allow room for the future. Lyra's presence in the room, her warmth and understanding, made that possibility seem a little less terrifying. She wasn't asking him to forget Eleanor. She wasn't asking him to move on immediately. She was simply offering him the grace to heal, to take the time he needed, and to find peace in the process. "I don't know what comes next," Julian said slowly, meeting her gaze. "But I think I'm ready to figure it out." Lyra nodded, her smile gentle. "You don't have to know everything right now. Just take it one day at a time." Julian gave a small, grateful nod. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He didn't have to face it alone. And that thought, that small flicker of connection, was enough to give him the courage to take the first step forward. As they stood there in silence, the weight of the past lingering in the corners of the room but not suffocating him, Julian realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running. It was time to face the future, with all its uncertainties, and trust that he had the strength to walk through it. For the first time in a long time, Julian allowed himself to believe that healing was possible, that love, even in its most complicated form, could find a way to break through the walls he had built around himself. And with that, he took the first step, ready to face whatever came next. Silas's warning. The next few days unfolded in a haze, and Julian found himself caught between the tension of his past and the pull of his future. He tried to focus on work, to bury himself in blueprints and meetings, but his thoughts always returned to Lyra. It was impossible to ignore the magnetic pull between them, and no matter how hard he tried to maintain distance, every interaction only seemed to strengthen the bond that was developing, an unspoken understanding that neither of them could escape. Lyra's presence in the house had become a quiet storm, one that Julian felt he was powerless to stop. They shared moments of conversation, of laughter, but there was always an undercurrent, a subtle shift in the air whenever they were near each other. It was as if they were both walking a tightrope, balancing on the precipice of something that could either bring them together or tear them apart. And then, one evening, the storm broke. Julian had just finished a late meeting in his office when he heard the sound of the door opening behind him. He turned to see Silas standing in the doorway, his face set in a stern expression that immediately made Julian's stomach churn. Silas had always been the more composed one, the friend who offered wisdom without judgment. But tonight, there was something different in his demeanor, a quiet intensity that sent a ripple of unease through Julian's chest. "Can we talk?" Silas asked, his voice low, but there was an edge to it that made Julian's heart skip a beat. "Of course," Julian replied, pushing away from his desk and standing up. He motioned for Silas to take a seat, but his friend remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides as if trying to keep his composure. "I've been watching you," Silas said quietly, his eyes narrowing as he met Julian's gaze. "And I can see what's happening here. Don't think I don't know. You're not fooling me." Julian froze. "What are you talking about?" he asked, though he already knew. He had been waiting for this moment, dreading it. He had hoped that the tension between him and Lyra could remain unspoken, that somehow they could avoid confronting it. But now, standing face to face with Silas, Julian realized that there was no running from the truth any longer. Silas took a deep breath, his jaw tightening as he exhaled. "I see the way you look at her. I hear the way you speak to her. I see the subtle changes in your behavior. And I'm telling you, Julian, this is not just some passing attraction. I can feel it in my bones." Julian's chest tightened. He could feel the weight of Silas's words pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had tried to ignore the pull, to keep things simple, but it had become impossible to deny what was happening. And now Silas was calling him out, and Julian couldn't hide from it any longer. "I know what you're thinking," Silas continued, his voice a mix of frustration and concern. "You're thinking that you're doing the right thing, that you're honoring Eleanor's memory by not moving on, by staying stuck in the past. But let me tell you, Julian, that's not how you honor her. You honor her by living, by moving forward, even when it's hard." Julian swallowed hard, the words cutting through him. He had spent so much time locked in his grief, so much time trying to preserve the memory of Eleanor, that he hadn't realized how much he had been suffocating himself. It wasn't just about honoring her anymore, it was about surviving, and surviving meant moving forward, even if it was terrifying. "I'm not trying to forget her," Julian said quietly, his voice trembling. "I don't know how to do that. She was everything to me. I can't just let go of her." Silas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know you can't, Julian. But you don't have to forget her. You just have to make room for something else in your life, something new, something that's not rooted in the past." Julian felt his heart race as Silas's words sank in. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready to confront the possibility of loving again, of letting someone else into the space that Eleanor had occupied. It felt like a betrayal, even if Silas was right. It felt like he was dishonoring the memory of the woman he had loved for so many years. "You're not just hurting yourself, Julian," Silas continued, his voice softer now, more pleading. "You're hurting her too. Lyra deserves to know where you stand. She deserves more than this uncertainty. You owe it to her to be honest with her, and you owe it to yourself to be honest with you." Julian closed his eyes, the weight of Silas's words crushing him. He had known, deep down, that this was coming. He had been avoiding the inevitable, avoiding the truth that his feelings for Lyra weren't just professional or friendly. But the fear of losing what was left of his connection to Eleanor had kept him frozen in place. He had kept Lyra at arm's length, trying to protect both himself and her from the consequences of what he was feeling. "I'm not ready for this, Silas," Julian said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to move forward. I don't know how to open myself up to her, to anyone. Not after everything I've been through." Silas looked at him for a long moment, his gaze heavy with something that Julian couldn't quite decipher. "You don't have to be ready, Julian. You just have to take the first step, and you don't have to do it alone. I'm here, and Lyra's here. But if you keep running, if you keep hiding, you're going to lose everything that matters." Julian felt the truth of Silas's words settle deep in his chest. He wasn't just running from Lyra, he was running from himself, from the possibility of feeling again, from the fear of betrayal, from the fear of losing what little was left of his connection to Eleanor. He took a deep breath and looked at Silas, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision before him. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice low. Silas's expression softened, and he stepped closer to Julian, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You stop running," he said gently. "You face the truth. And you choose what's best for you, even if it's hard. Especially if it's hard." Julian nodded slowly, the weight of the decision settling in. He didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't keep running. He had to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. And with that, Julian made a decision. He was ready to stop hiding. He was ready to face the future, whatever it looked like. Crossing a line. The days after his conversation with Silas felt like a slow unfolding. Julian wasn't sure if he was ready for what was coming, but he knew one thing. He couldn't keep avoiding it. The tension with Lyra had reached a point where it was almost impossible to ignore. She was no longer just his best friend's daughter, and he was no longer the man who had vowed to live in the shadows of his past. Something had shifted between them, and it was time for him to face that shift head-on. That evening, after a long day of meetings and paperwork, Julian found himself on the porch again. staring out at the vast expanse of the Hudson Valley. The sun was just beginning to set, painting the sky with soft pinks and oranges, the light filtering through the trees in delicate rays. It was a peaceful scene, one that should have been calming, but Julian felt the familiar unease in his chest. Every passing moment seemed to heighten the tension between him and Lyra, and the longer he let it fester, the harder it would be to address. He heard the soft creak of the door behind him, followed by footsteps approaching on the wooden floor. He didn't need to look to know who it was. He could feel her presence like an electric current in the air. "Lyra." "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Julian turned to face her, and his heart skipped a beat. She was standing there in the fading light, looking more beautiful than ever, her hair flowing gently in the evening breeze. There was a quiet confidence in the way she stood, her posture open and unguarded, and yet there was something else in her eyes, an intensity that mirrored his own uncertainty. They were both standing on the edge of something, and neither of them knew how to take the first step. "Of course," Julian replied, his voice hoarse as he motioned to the empty chair beside him. She walked over and sat down, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating off her, yet still far enough to maintain the space that had kept them apart for so long. For a few moments they sat in silence, the only sound the soft rustling of the trees and the distant calls of birds settling in for the night. Julian couldn't bring himself to speak first, and he could tell Lyra was waiting for him to say something. There was a question hanging between them, an unspoken truth that neither of them had dared to address. Finally, Lyra broke the silence, her voice gentle but full of purpose. "Julian, we need to talk. About everything." He met her gaze, the weight of her words sinking into him. "I know," he said quietly. "I've been avoiding this, avoiding you, and I'm sorry for that." Lyra shook her head, a small, sad smile tugging at her lips. "It's not just you. I've been avoiding it too. But we can't keep pretending this, whatever this is, isn't happening." Julian swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had been afraid of this moment, of confronting the truth that had been building between them. But the fear was quickly giving way to something else, a mix of longing, uncertainty, and something deeper that he couldn't quite name. "I don't know how we got here," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. You're Silas's daughter, and I'm your friend. I shouldn't feel the way I do about you." Lyra turned to face him fully, her expression softening. "But you do, don't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You feel it too. I know you do." Julian closed his eyes, the truth of her words hitting him with a force he hadn't expected. He had spent so much time trying to push down his feelings, trying to deny the attraction he had felt for her. But now, with her sitting beside him, her presence like a spark that lit everything inside him on fire, he couldn't pretend anymore. He nodded slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. "I do," he admitted, his voice raw. "I've tried to fight it. I've tried to ignore it. But I can't. Not anymore." Lyra's eyes softened, and she reached out, her hand brushing against his. The simple touch sent a shockwave through him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They were both feeling it now, the undeniable pull that had been building between them, a connection that had crossed the line from something innocent and familial to something far more complicated. "I don't want to hurt you," Julian said, his voice filled with regret. "And I don't want to hurt Silas, but I can't keep pretending like this doesn't matter." Lyra's fingers tightened around his, and she met his gaze with a clarity that took him by surprise. "You're not hurting anyone," she said, her voice firm. "This is about us, what we feel, what we need, and if we keep hiding from it, we'll just hurt ourselves in the end." Julian's heart raced as he looked at her. She was right. He had been hiding from this, hiding from the truth of his feelings for so long that he had convinced himself it wasn't real. But now, sitting here with her, he knew it was real. It wasn't just attraction. It was something deeper. It was a connection that had been building, unspoken over the years. It was something they both had to confront, whether they were ready or not. "I don't know what to do with this," Julian said, his voice trembling. I don't know how to move forward, how to make this right. Lyra gave him a soft, reassuring smile. We'll figure it out, she said, her voice gentle. But we have to be honest with each other. We have to be honest with ourselves. For a long moment they sat there, the quiet of the evening surrounding them. Julian could feel the weight of the decision before him. He knew that crossing this line would change everything. It would change his relationship with Silas, with Lyra, and with himself. But the truth was he didn't want to keep running from it anymore. He didn't want to deny the feelings that had been stirring inside him for so long. I'm scared, Julian admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I'm scared of what this means, of what happens next. Lyra turned to him, her expression soft but resolute. It's okay to be scared. We're both scared, but we can't let fear control us. We have to trust what we feel. Julian looked into her eyes, the sincerity and vulnerability he saw there making his heart ache. He knew that this wasn't going to be easy, but in that moment, he also knew that it was worth it. The fear, the uncertainty, it was all part of the journey. And for the first time in a long time, Julian felt ready to take that step. Okay, he said softly, his voice steadying. Let's do this. Together. Lyra smiled, her eyes filled with something new. Hope, perhaps, or the promise of something more. Julian didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he was ready to face it. With her. The burden of guilt. Julian sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of papers and blueprints, but none of it seemed real. The weight of the world was pressing down on him, and he couldn't escape the heavy feeling in his chest. The conversation with Lyra had left him unsettled, her touch, her words, still echoing in his mind. Every time he tried to focus on work, his thoughts would drift back to her, back to the undeniable truth that something between them had shifted, something he couldn't undo. He had promised himself that he would move forward, that he would finally face the feelings he had been hiding for so long. But even as he took that first step toward honesty, the guilt gnawed at him. Guilt over his growing attraction to Lyra, guilt over betraying the memory of Eleanor, and guilt over the unspoken promise he had made to his best friend Silas. Every part of him screamed that he was doing something wrong, that he was crossing a line that should never have been crossed. The sound of a knock on the door broke his reverie, and Julian looked up to see Lyra standing in the doorway. She was dressed in her usual professional attire, tailored pants, a crisp blouse, but there was a softness in her eyes that made Julian's heart skip a beat. He stood up quickly, as if caught off guard by her sudden presence, though he had been expecting it. Julian? Lyra said, her voice steady, but with a hint of uncertainty. Can we talk? Julian motioned to the chair across from his desk, his heart heavy with the thought of what was to come. They had both been avoiding the conversation that needed to happen. The lines between them had been blurred, and neither of them knew how to proceed. But there was no escaping it now. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. Of course, Julian replied, his voice strained. Have a seat. Lyra sat down, folding her hands in her lap, her gaze fixed on him. For a moment, there was silence between them, an awkward, uncomfortable silence that seemed to hang in the air. Julian could feel the weight of her eyes on him, but he couldn't bring himself to look at her. He had spent so much time trying to avoid this moment, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure he could handle it. Finally, Lyra spoke, her voice soft but firm. I've been thinking about us, about everything that's happened between us, and I think it's time we talked about it. Julian took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he leaned against the desk. I know, he said quietly. I've been thinking about it too, but I don't know how to make this right. Lyra studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face. You don't need to make anything right, Julian. You don't have to fix anything. I just need you to be honest with me. His chest tightened at her words, the vulnerability in her voice piercing through the fog of guilt that had clouded his mind. He had been hiding from the truth for so long, afraid of the consequences of his feelings for her. But now, sitting across from her, he realized that it was time to face it. Time to face what was happening between them, and what it meant. I don't know how to do this, Julian confessed, his voice hoarse. I don't know how to love again, how to move forward without betraying everything that came before. Eleanor. She was my life. I promised her I would never love anyone else. And now, here I am, falling for you, and I don't know what to do with that. Lyra's eyes softened, and she reached out, placing her hand gently over his. The touch was warm, comforting, and Julian felt a flood of emotions surge through him. Desire, regret, fear, and longing. But most of all, he felt the weight of the guilt that had been consuming him for so long. You're not betraying her, Julian, Lyra said, her voice steady. You're not forgetting her. You're just allowing yourself to live, to feel again. Eleanor wouldn't want you to spend your whole life mourning her. She would want you to be happy. Julian shook his head, the guilt threatening to suffocate him. But how can I be happy when I've been lying to myself? Lying to Silas? I've been keeping my distance from you, trying to keep things normal. But I can't pretend anymore. I can't pretend that I don't feel what I feel. Lyra squeezed his hand, her grip firm yet comforting. You don't have to pretend, Julian, not with me. You can be real with me. I'm not asking you to forget her. I'm asking you to let yourself move forward, to give yourself permission to feel something for me without guilt. The words hit him harder than he expected, and for the first time in a long while, Julian felt a flicker of hope. The idea that he didn't have to carry the weight of guilt forever, that he could allow himself to feel again, was both terrifying and liberating. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this, Julian admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I'm ready to let go of the past. You don't have to let go of the past, Lyra said softly. You just have to make room for the future. You have to trust that it's okay to live again. Julian looked at her, his chest tightening as he realized how much he had been holding back. The fear, the guilt, the uncertainty. It had all been building up inside him, and he had been too afraid to face it. But here was Lyra, offering him a way out, offering him the freedom to move forward without abandoning the past. I don't want to hurt Silas, Julian said, his voice filled with regret. He's my best friend. I don't know how to reconcile what I feel for you with what I owe him. Lyra's expression softened. You don't have to make any decisions today, Julian. I'm not asking you to choose between me and Silas, but you do need to be honest with him. You need to stop hiding. Julian nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He knew she was right. He had been hiding from Silas, from the truth of his feelings, for far too long. And if he didn't come clean to his best friend, it would only tear them apart. I'll talk to him, Julian said quietly, his voice firm with resolve. I'll tell him the truth. It's time. Lyra smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. You don't have to do it alone, Julian. I'm here for you. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. For the first time in what felt like forever, Julian felt a sense of peace settle over him. The guilt, the fear, the uncertainty, they were still there, but they didn't feel as suffocating anymore. With Lyra by his side, he knew that he could face whatever came next. He wasn't ready to move on completely, but he was ready to start the journey. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. A night to remember. The days leading up to the evening of Julian's conversation with Silas felt like an emotional roller coaster, with waves of fear, guilt, and anticipation crashing over him. Julian knew the moment was coming when he would have to face Silas, to tell him the truth about his feelings for Lyra. He had no idea how his best friend would react. Would Silas understand? Or would it tear apart the foundation of their decades-long friendship? The evening arrived sooner than expected, and the house was filled with a strange, tense energy. Silas had been distant for the past few days, his eyes often clouded with a mix of concern and frustration. Julian had always known that Silas had an uncanny ability to read him, to sense when something was wrong, and tonight felt like the breaking point. But even more than the conversation with Silas, Julian couldn't shake the anticipation of the time he would spend with Lyra. He hadn't seen her since the moment he realized that he couldn't run from what was happening between them. The moon was high in the sky, casting its pale light over the vast landscape. The house felt too quiet, the silence almost suffocating. Julian stood in the kitchen, staring out at the darkened valley, trying to calm his nerves. His heart raced, his palms sweating. Tonight, everything would change. Lyra had told him that she would be waiting for him outside, on the porch, where they had shared so many quiet moments together. She had told him to meet her after dinner, when they could be alone, away from the watchful eyes of Silas. Julian didn't know what to expect, but he knew that this night would be the beginning of something new, something that couldn't be undone. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and walked to the back door. As he stepped outside, the cool night air hit his skin, the gentle breeze brushing against his face. The stars overhead were brilliant, a blanket of light stretched across the sky. He spotted Lyra standing at the edge of the porch, her back to him, looking out at the view. Her silhouette was bathed in silver light, and for a moment Julian couldn't move. There was something about the way she stood, something so serene, yet full of strength. She turned slowly, sensing his presence, and smiled when she saw him. "Julian," she said softly, her voice like a gentle whisper against the night. "I've been waiting." Julian's heart skipped a beat. "Sorry I'm late," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He stepped forward, walking toward her slowly. There was so much he wanted to say, so much that had been building inside him. But he didn't have the words just yet. Lyra's smile was warm, but there was something deeper behind it, something unspoken, a quiet understanding between them. She stepped closer to him, her eyes searching his face, as if she was waiting for him to say something, anything. And in that moment, Julian realized that this wasn't just about tonight. It was about everything that had led them here. The unspoken tension, the stolen glances, the moments that had felt like they were meant to happen, even if neither of them had been ready for them. "You look beautiful," Julian said, his voice low. He didn't know why he said it, but the words felt right. They were simple, but true. Lyra had always been beautiful, in a way that was different from other women. There was a quiet elegance to her, a timeless quality that had only grown stronger with the years. But tonight, something about her presence, the way she stood there in the moonlight, made her seem even more radiant. Lyra's eyes softened, and she stepped even closer, closing the distance between them. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible against the wind. She reached out and touched his arm, her fingers brushing against his skin. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, close enough to feel each other's warmth, but still holding back. "Julian," Lyra said after a beat, her voice steady but with an edge of vulnerability. "I've been thinking about everything, about us, and I just need you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Julian swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I know," he said, his voice thick. "I've been running from this, Lyra. I've been trying to hide from what's happening between us, but I can't anymore. I'm sorry I've been distant. It's not that I didn't care, it's just I didn't know how to handle it." Lyra looked at him with understanding in her eyes, her gaze soft and patient. "You don't have to apologize, Julian. I know it's complicated, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm here, and I want to be with you." The words hit Julian like a punch to the chest. He had wanted this, wanted her, for so long, but he had been too afraid to admit it, to admit that he was ready to move forward, ready to open himself up again. He had been hiding behind guilt, behind fear, but tonight, standing here with her, he realized that he didn't want to hide anymore. Without thinking, Julian reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheek. Her eyes closed for a brief moment, and Julian leaned in, closing the gap between them. He kissed her softly at first, tentatively, as if he was testing the waters, waiting for her to pull away. But she didn't. Instead, she kissed him back, her lips soft but sure. The kiss deepened, and Julian felt the world fade away. It was just the two of them, standing on the porch under the moonlight, lost in the moment. He didn't know where this would lead, what the consequences would be, but for the first time in months he didn't care. In that kiss, Julian found everything he had been searching for. peace, clarity, and a connection that was stronger than any fear he had ever known. When they finally pulled away, breathless and a little dazed, Lyra smiled at him, her face flushed. "I've been waiting for that," she said softly, her voice full of warmth. Julian's heart was still racing, but now it was filled with something else. Hope. "Me too," he whispered. "I've been waiting too." And as they stood there together, the night wrapped around them like a soft embrace, Julian knew that this was only the beginning. They had crossed a line, and though it terrified him, it also felt like the most natural thing in the world. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And for the first time in a long time, Julian was ready for whatever the future held. Silas finds out. The next few days felt like a whirlwind for Julian. Every moment with Lyra was like a revelation, a new chapter in a story that had been unfolding quietly for months. He had spent so much time running from his feelings, trying to bury them under layers of guilt and regret. But now, with Lyra by his side, things felt different. He felt alive again, in a way he hadn't since Eleanor's death. But with the joy of finally embracing what he felt for Lyra, came the ever-present fear of what it would mean for his relationship with Silas. He hadn't told his best friend yet. Part of him feared that the friendship they had built over 20 years would crumble, that Silas would see his actions as a betrayal. The bond they shared was deeper than words could express. They had been through so much together, career struggles, family losses, personal triumphs. The thought of losing that, of losing Silas, filled Julian with a sense of dread that overshadowed everything else. For days, Julian had told himself he needed to talk to Silas. He had rehearsed the conversation in his head 1,000 times, but each time he tried to bring it up, his courage faltered. How could he explain to the man who had been his brother for so long that he was falling in love with his daughter? How could he possibly justify that? But Julian knew that sooner or later, the truth would come out. It always did. And when it did, he would have to face the consequences. That afternoon, Silas came to the house unexpectedly. He had stopped by a few times in the past week, but today, there was something different about the way he walked in. His shoulders tight, his expression guarded. Julian felt his stomach drop as he stood up from the desk where he had been working. He could feel it in the air, the tension, the unspoken words that had been hanging between them. "Hey," Silas said, his voice gruff. "Got a minute?" Julian nodded, trying to push down the wave of anxiety that was rising in him. "Of course. What's up?" Silas glanced around the room, as if searching for something that wasn't there. He didn't immediately sit down, instead leaning against the doorframe. His arms were crossed and his jaw was clenched. It was the first time Julian had seen him this tense in years, and it only made his heart beat faster. "I need to ask you something," Silas said, his voice low. "Something I've been noticing, something that doesn't sit right with me." Julian's stomach twisted, and for a moment, he thought he might choke on the words that were building in his throat. He had hoped to control when this conversation happened, to be the one who initiated it. But now, standing in front of Silas, he realized that it had already started. "Go ahead," Julian said, his voice hoarse. "What's on your mind?" Silas's gaze locked onto his, piercing and unwavering. "I've been seeing the way you've been looking at Lyra," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "And I can feel it. There's something going on between you two, isn't there?" Julian's heart slammed against his chest, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. The truth was out in the open, hanging between them like an elephant in the room. He had never imagined that Silas would confront him like this, but now that it had happened, Julian realized there was no running from it. I don't know what you're talking about," Julian stammered, his mind racing. "Silas, Don't lie to me," Silas interrupted, his voice cold but tinged with pain. "I'm not an idiot, Julian. I see the way you two interact, the way she looks at you, the way you look at her. I can feel the tension, don't think I haven't noticed." Julian swallowed hard, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He had hoped to keep things quiet, to protect Silas from the truth, but now that it was out, the weight of it was suffocating. His best friend knew, and there was no going back. I never meant for this to happen, Julian said quietly, his voice cracking under the weight of the confession. It just did. Silas took a step forward, his eyes hard. You're telling me that you're in love with my daughter. You're telling me that after everything we've been through, everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? By falling in love with my daughter? Julian flinched at the words. They stung, cutting deep into his chest. He could see the hurt in Silas's eyes, and for a moment, he felt like the worst person in the world. He had known this would hurt Silas, but he hadn't known how much. I never meant to hurt you, Julian said, his voice filled with regret. I've spent the last few months trying to deny what I feel for her. I've tried to bury it, to keep things normal, to protect you both. But I can't keep doing that. I can't keep pretending that I don't feel what I feel. Silas's face twisted in disbelief. Pretending? You think this is something you can just sweep under the rug and pretend like it's not happening? You've crossed a line, Julian, and you're asking me to just sit back and act like everything is fine? Julian closed his eyes, his chest tight. I don't expect you to be fine with it. I don't even know how to make it right, but I can't change what's happened. I can't change the way I feel. Silas stood in front of him, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. So what? You're just going to walk away from everything, from our friendship, from your loyalty to me? You're going to throw that all away for something that's never going to work? You're not even thinking about the consequences, are you? The words hit Julian like a slap to the face. He knew that Silas was right. He hadn't thought through everything. He hadn't fully considered how this would affect his friendship, how it would change everything. But at the same time, he couldn't ignore what he felt. He couldn't push away his love for Lyra, no matter how complicated it was. I never wanted any of this, Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I can't deny what's happening. I can't deny what I feel for her. Silas's face softened for a brief moment, but the pain in his eyes was still there. I don't know how to fix this, Julian, he said quietly. I don't know how to move past this. I need some time. Julian nodded, his heart heavy. I understand. I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to betray you. Silas gave him a tight nod before turning toward the door. I need to think. I need some space to process this. But you need to know, Julian, that this changes everything. As Silas left the room, Julian stood there, his heart breaking. He had known this was coming, but he wasn't prepared for the weight of it. He had just shattered something he had spent years building, and now, as he stood there alone, he realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The fallout. The days following the confrontation with Silas were filled with a thick, oppressive silence that seemed to pervade every corner of the house. Julian had spent most of his time holed up in his office, trying to focus on work, but the weight of his guilt and the consequences of his actions hung over him like a storm cloud. The words Silas had said kept replaying in his mind, each one cutting deeper into his already fragile conscience. You've crossed a line. This changes everything. Silas had left the house the night after their conversation, retreating to his own space to process the betrayal. He hadn't returned since, and Julian hadn't had the courage to reach out. The distance between them was too wide now. The friendship they had shared for over 2 decades felt like it was slipping away, and Julian had no idea how to fix it, or if it could even be repaired. But as much as Julian wanted to avoid the situation, he knew he couldn't hide forever. He had to face Silas. He had to make things right, even if that meant confronting the pain and the fallout from what had happened. But there was one more conversation he needed to have before that could happen, the conversation with Lyra. For the past few days, they had danced around each other, their interactions strained and cautious. Every moment with Lyra had been bittersweet. She was still here, still part of his life, but there was a tension between them now, one that neither of them knew how to break. Julian could see it in her eyes. She was waiting for him to figure things out. She had always been patient, but now there was an uncertainty in her gaze, a quiet fear that perhaps everything they had shared was slipping away. Julian walked through the house, his footsteps heavy as he made his way to the living room. It was late in the evening, and the house was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the soft glow of the lamp beside him. The weight of everything, Silas, Lyra, the guilt, pressed down on him with each step. He found Lyra sitting on the couch staring out the window, her posture tense. She had always been so confident, but now she looked small, fragile. Julian felt a pang of regret in his chest, the realization that he was responsible for this, responsible for the emotional distance that had crept between them. "Lyra," Julian said softly, stepping into the room. She turned to look at him, and he saw the hurt in her eyes, the same hurt he had been trying to avoid for so long. "Julian," she replied, her voice quiet, but with a hint of uncertainty. "We need to talk." Julian nodded, taking a seat beside her. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to make things right. The words felt stuck in his throat, tangled with the fear that no matter what he said, it wouldn't be enough to repair the damage. "I'm sorry," Julian said after a long silence. His voice cracked and he had to swallow hard to keep his emotions in check. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to hurt anyone. But I can't deny what I feel, Lyra. I can't pretend anymore. I thought I could keep it under control, but I've failed you. I've failed Silas." Lyra's gaze softened, but there was still a sadness in her eyes, a sense of betrayal that Julian couldn't ignore. "Julian, I don't know what to say," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought we were in this together. I thought we could figure it out. But now everything's falling apart. You've hurt my father, and you've hurt me." The words hit Julian like a punch to the stomach. He had always feared this moment, the moment when his actions would shatter the delicate balance between him and Lyra. But hearing her say it out loud made it feel real, made the weight of his choices unbearable. "I know," Julian whispered, his voice full of regret. "I didn't want this to happen. I didn't want to hurt anyone. But I can't keep pretending. I can't keep living a lie. And I understand if you're angry, if you need time. But I need to be honest with you. I care about you, more than I've cared about anyone in a long time. And I can't just walk away from that." Lyra's eyes filled with tears, and Julian's heart broke at the sight. He had never wanted to make her cry, never wanted to put her in this position. "But you already have walked away," Lyra said softly, her voice shaking. "You've hurt me, Julian. You've hurt my father. And now everything is changing, and I don't know if I can fix it. I don't know if we can fix it." The pain in her voice twisted something deep inside Julian. He had been so focused on his own guilt, his own fears, that he hadn't realized the depth of the hurt he had caused. He had been so determined to protect Lyra, to protect Silas, that he hadn't considered how much they would all be affected by his choices. "I never wanted to hurt you," Julian said, his voice cracking. "I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix this." Lyra took a deep breath, wiping her eyes. She looked at him, her expression torn between frustration and sadness. "I don't know what to do either," she said quietly. "I don't know if we can just go back to how things were. I don't know if we can fix this. But I need time, Julian. I need time to figure out what this means for me, for us." Julian nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had caused this. He had let his emotions cloud his judgment, and now he was left with the consequences. "I understand," Julian said softly. "I'll give you the time you need. I'll give you the space to figure things out." Lyra gave him a small, sad smile. "Thank you, Julian. I don't know what to say. I don't know what happens next." Julian stood up slowly, his body aching from the weight of their conversation. "I don't know either. But I'll be here, Lyra. Whenever you're ready to talk, whenever you're ready to figure this out, I'll be here." With that, he turned and walked away, his heart heavy with the uncertainty of what was to come. He knew that the fallout from his actions wasn't over, that the consequences would continue to unfold. But for now, all he could do was wait. Wait for Silas to process the betrayal. Wait for Lyra to find her own path, and hope, somewhere deep inside, that they could all find a way back to each other. Lyra's decision. The silence in the house was almost suffocating. Julian had spent the past few days in his office, working more out of habit than necessity. Every time he tried to focus on a project, his thoughts would drift back to the conversations that had unfolded over the past week. The ones with Silas, the ones with Lyra, the ones that had changed everything. He hadn't spoken to Lyra since that night on the porch. She had said she needed time, and Julian had promised to give it to her. But as the days passed, the weight of her absence seemed to grow heavier. He missed her more than he cared to admit. The emptiness in the house felt like a constant reminder that he had crossed a line, and now he was waiting for the fallout to come, unsure of what it would mean for their future. Every time the phone rang, Julian felt a jolt of hope. Was it Lyra? Was it Silas? Maybe they were ready to talk. But each time, it wasn't them. Each call only served to remind him of the uncertainty that had taken root in his life. The guilt, the fear, and the sadness had become a permanent fixture in his mind. And then, one afternoon, Lyra called. "Julian," she said, her voice softer than it had been in days. "Can we talk?" His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't realized how much he had been hoping for this moment until he heard her voice. "Of course," Julian replied, trying to keep the excitement out of his voice. "Where are you?" "I'm at the house," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Can you meet me outside?" Julian didn't hesitate. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." He quickly put down the phone and walked outside. The sky was overcast, the air thick with the humidity of an approaching storm. The house felt smaller now, more confining than ever before. He stepped out onto the porch, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Lyra. His pulse quickened when he saw her, standing at the edge of the yard, a figure against the gray backdrop of the sky. She was facing away from him, her posture tense, as if she had been waiting for something or someone. Julian approached her slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what she was going to say, but he could feel the weight of her decision in the air between them. When she turned to face him, he could see the weariness in her eyes, the quiet sadness that had taken root since their last conversation. But there was also something else, something stronger than before. There was resolve, a quiet strength in the way she held herself, as if she had finally found the clarity she needed. "Lyra," Julian said softly, his voice cracking. "I've been waiting for this, for you to be ready to talk." She smiled faintly, but didn't speak right away. Instead, she took a deep breath, as though gathering her thoughts, preparing herself for something difficult. "I've been thinking a lot," Lyra said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened, the way things have changed so quickly between us, the way it feels like we've crossed a line that we can't undo. And I've had to think about what it means for me, what it means for us." Julian held his breath, waiting for her to continue, unsure of where this conversation would go. Every part of him wanted to say something, to fix whatever had gone wrong, but he knew he had to let her speak first. "I don't want you to think that I'm blaming you for what's happened," Lyra continued. "I'm not. I know that this is complicated, that we're both feeling things we didn't expect, but I also know that I can't keep living in this uncertainty. I can't keep waiting for things to fix themselves." Julian felt his chest tighten. "Lyra, I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for any of this to happen. I know I've made mistakes, and I'm sorry for everything. But I don't want to lose you. I don't know what the future holds, but I want to face it with you." Lyra's eyes softened, but her gaze remained steady. "I know you didn't mean to hurt me, and I don't want to lose you either. But I need to know if this is something we can really build together. If we can figure this out, despite everything. I need to know that we're not just doing this because it's what we want in the moment. I need to know that we're making this decision because it's something real, something lasting." Julian's heart ached. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the fear of the unknown that mirrored his own. But he also saw something else, a quiet hope, a longing for a future that was still uncertain, but one that they could build together if they were brave enough to take the leap. "I can't promise you that it'll be easy," Julian said, his voice low but firm. "I can't promise that we won't face challenges, but I can promise you that I'll do everything I can to make this work. I'm not running from you anymore, Lyra. I'm not running from what we feel. I'm here, and I'm willing to face whatever comes next with you." Lyra took a step closer to him, her eyes searching his face as though she was trying to gauge the truth in his words. After a long pause, she nodded slowly, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Then let's take it one step at a time," she said softly. "Let's figure this out together. But I need to know that you're in this with me. Not because of guilt or obligation, but because you want this too. You want to be with me, Julian. For who I am. Not because I'm just here to fill a void." Julian's heart swelled with emotion as he looked at her. He had never been more sure of anything in his life. "I want you, Lyra. I want to be with you. I want to build something real with you, something that lasts." For the first time in days, Lyra's smile widened and her eyes softened. She reached out, her hand finding his, and for a moment everything felt still. The storm that had been building in his chest finally calmed, and Julian felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known he was capable of. They didn't have all the answers. They didn't know what the future would bring. But they were taking the first step toward it, together. "I'm not afraid anymore," Lyra said quietly, her voice full of conviction. "We can do this, Julian. We just have to trust each other." Julian squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of her words settle deep in his chest. "We will. We'll figure it out. Together." And as the first raindrops began to fall, soft and steady, Julian knew that this was just the beginning. They had taken the leap, and whatever came next, they would face it side by side. A new beginning. The days after Lyra's decision to move forward with Julian were a mix of relief and quiet anticipation. Julian had never known peace like this before. There were still unspoken fears, and uncertainties loomed like shadows in the corners of his mind. But each day with Lyra felt like a step closer to something real. They were no longer hiding from what they felt, and though the journey ahead was bound to be complicated, it was a journey they would take together. Julian knew that Silas had to be told the truth. No matter how much he dreaded it, the time had come to face his friend, his confidant, the man who had been like family to him for years. The weight of his silence felt unbearable, but there was still a deep fear in Julian's chest about how Silas would react. Could their friendship withstand the revelation that Julian had fallen in love with his daughter? Or would it fracture beyond repair? As the evening approached, Julian sat in the living room, staring at the phone in his hand. He had tried to prepare himself for this moment, to come up with the right words, but they seemed elusive, just out of reach. He hadn't seen Silas in days. It was clear that Silas was giving him space, waiting for Julian to come to him, to be the one to start the conversation. The phone in Julian's hand buzzed, and his heart skipped a beat. It was a text from Silas. "Can we meet tomorrow? I need to talk." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, the uncertainty of what was to come settling over him. He had known that this moment was inevitable, but the reality of it felt like a shock to his system. He quickly typed a response. "Of course. What time works for you?" He stared at the screen for a long moment, waiting for the response that would determine how this conversation would go. "Let's meet at the house. I'll be there at noon." The words were short, practical, and yet they carried the weight of everything Julian had been avoiding. Tomorrow. Tomorrow he would face Silas, and there would be no more running from the truth. He had no idea how to make it right, how to explain the depth of his feelings for Lyra, but he knew that keeping this secret any longer wasn't an option. It had to be done. As the evening wore on, Julian tried to focus on the things that had once brought him comfort, the work that had been his refuge, the quiet moments with Lyra. But there was no escaping the looming conversation with Silas. It was the one thing that occupied his thoughts. Lyra had given him the space to figure things out, and now, it was time for him to do the same for Silas. The next morning, Julian woke early, his nerves already on edge. The clock ticked slowly as the hours passed, the tension building with every minute. He found himself pacing the house, unable to sit still. Lyra had already gone out for a walk, giving him the space he needed to prepare for what was about to happen. He couldn't help but wonder how Silas had been feeling, what had been going through his mind since their last conversation. When noon finally arrived, Julian stood at the door, watching the driveway for Silas's car. He wasn't sure how he would explain everything, how he would even begin to make sense of the mess he had made. But he had to try. It was the only way forward. The sound of a car pulling up outside broke his reverie, and Julian stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He opened the door, and there stood Silas standing on the threshold, his face a mixture of resolve and guarded emotion. The years of friendship between them felt like a weight, one that they had both been carrying, but now it was time to put it down. "Silas," Julian said quietly, stepping aside to let his friend in. Silas nodded curtly, stepping into the house with a deliberate pace, his eyes scanning the room, though he didn't seem to be truly seeing anything. He paused for a moment, his hand running through his hair as if trying to collect his thoughts. Finally, he turned to face Julian. "I've been thinking a lot," Silas said, his voice low. "About everything. About you and Lyra, about us. And I've realized something. I'm angry, but I'm also disappointed." The words hit Julian like a punch. He had expected anger, but to hear the word disappointment from Silas, someone who had always been a source of strength in his life, was worse than anything he had anticipated. "I never wanted to disappoint you, Silas," Julian said, his voice filled with regret. "I never wanted to hurt you. But I can't change what's happened. I can't change how I feel." Silas crossed his arms, his gaze hardening. "I get it," he said quietly. "I know that feelings are complicated, that life doesn't always work out the way we expect. But what I don't get is how you let it go this far, how you let it get this messy." Julian swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I've been trying to figure out how to make it right, Silas. But the more I tried to push it down, the harder it got. I couldn't hide from what I feel anymore. I care about Lyra. I didn't want it to be this way, but it is." Silas's eyes softened, but only slightly. "I know you didn't plan this, but it still doesn't change the fact that you've crossed a line. She's my daughter, Julian, and I've always trusted you, but now I'm wondering if I've been blind." Julian felt a pang of guilt shoot through him, a sharp ache in his chest. "I've been trying to protect both of you. I've been trying to figure out how to love her without destroying everything we've built. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want to hurt her." For a long moment, Silas didn't say anything. The room was thick with tension, and Julian could hear the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears. Finally, Silas spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I don't know where we go from here," Silas said, his gaze softening as he looked at Julian. "But I need you to know that this isn't something I can just accept overnight. It's going to take time, a lot of time. But I won't give up on you, on us." The words felt like a lifeline, and Julian's chest tightened as he absorbed the meaning behind them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step toward healing, toward finding a way through the mess they had created. "I don't want to lose you, Silas," Julian said quietly. "You've been my brother for so long, I never meant to jeopardize that." Silas nodded, his gaze steady but still tinged with sadness. "Neither did I, but we'll figure this out. It might not be easy, but I'll be here. I owe you that much." For the first time in days, Julian allowed himself to breathe, the weight of the conversation slowly lifting. It wouldn't be easy. There would be more difficult conversations ahead, more painful moments. But for now, the worst was over. "I'm sorry," Julian said again, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Silas gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "We'll get through it, Julian. We always do." And as they stood there amidst the wreckage of their past, Julian realized that this wasn't the end. It was just another beginning. Moving forward together. The days after Julian's conversation with Silas were strange, like stepping into a new life while still carrying the old one around. The tension in the house had softened slightly, but the silence between Julian and Lyra remained. It was no longer the unbearable silence it had been before they'd acknowledged their feelings for each other. Now, it was something different, something they both needed to work through together. The unspoken words, the emotions that had been building were still there, but now there was a tentative hope that perhaps, in time, things would change for the better. Julian had been giving Lyra the space she had asked for, but he was also aware that they couldn't avoid talking forever. After his conversation with Silas, he knew that there were still bridges to cross, conversations to be had, and feelings to be unpacked. It wasn't just about Lyra's father. It was about what they both wanted from the future. The evening came as quietly as every other day. The sky had turned a soft shade of lavender as the sun set over the valley. Julian found himself outside again, standing on the porch, looking out at the vastness of the landscape. It was a beautiful view, but it had become a bit too familiar in recent weeks. Too still, too quiet. He was beginning to understand why he had always sought distractions in work before. It was easier than dealing with emotions, with the weight of life's uncertainties. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and for a moment, he considered ignoring it, but something told him it might be important. He pulled it out and saw Lyra's name on the screen. His heart skipped a beat, a mix of anticipation and anxiety flooding him. "Can we talk?" The message read. He didn't waste any time replying. "Of course." "Where are you?" "In the garden." "Can you meet me?" Julian quickly put his phone back in his pocket and stepped off the porch, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what to expect from the conversation. He had tried to give her space, tried to let her process everything, but now something told him it was time for them to finally address the unspoken things that still hung between them. The garden was a quiet, peaceful place at the back of the house, a sanctuary that Lyra often retreated to when she needed to think. Julian stepped through the archway into the small, overgrown area, and immediately he saw her sitting on one of the stone benches, her back to him. The faint sound of wind chimes danced in the air, and the scent of jasmine filled the space around him. Lyra looked up as he approached, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. She had her arms wrapped around herself, as though she were trying to keep something inside from spilling over. "Hi," Julian said softly, standing a few feet away from her. "How are you?" Lyra smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I've been better," she replied, her voice soft and distant. "But I'm okay." Julian felt the weight of her words, the distance she was keeping between them. It made him ache. He took a step forward, lowering himself to the bench beside her. "I've been thinking a lot," Lyra continued, her voice still distant. "About what you said, about what we both feel, and about Silas, about everything." Julian nodded, unsure of what to say. He had already spilled his heart out to her, told her everything, but now as they sat there together, he realized that their journey hadn't even begun yet. It wasn't just about being honest with each other. It was about finding a way to move forward without destroying what they had once shared, without complicating things further. "I know things are complicated," Julian said quietly. "I know I've made mistakes, but I don't regret how I feel about you, Lyra. I just want you to know that." Lyra looked at him, her gaze searching his face, looking for something, maybe reassurance, maybe truth. "I don't regret it either," she said, her voice softer now. "But I'm scared, Julian. I'm scared of what it means for me. For us." Julian felt a lump form in his throat. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "I know, I'm scared too," he admitted, his voice thick. "But I don't want to run anymore. I don't want to hide from what we have. It's real, Lyra. It's something that's been building for a long time, even when we didn't see it." Lyra squeezed his hand, her eyes filling with something he couldn't quite define. Maybe hope, maybe fear, maybe both. "I know. But everything has changed. My father, our friendship, all of it. And I don't know how to make sense of it." Julian nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He had been trying to figure out how to make everything work too. He knew that Silas was still hurt, still processing everything that had happened, but he also knew that their love, what they had, was worth fighting for. "We don't have to have all the answers right now," Julian said, his voice gentle but firm. "We can take it one day at a time, together." Lyra's gaze softened, and she nodded slowly. "One day at a time," she repeated, as though testing the idea in her mind. "Yeah," Julian said, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and determination. "We'll figure it out. We'll face whatever comes together. I'm not going anywhere. I want this, Lyra. I want you. Lyra looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to make sure that he meant every word. And then, finally, her lips curved into a small smile. I want you too, she whispered. And in that moment, the world seemed to shift. The weight of all the uncertainty, the guilt, the fear, they didn't disappear, but they didn't feel as suffocating anymore. Julian knew that their path wouldn't be easy. There would be more challenges ahead, more difficult conversations, more moments of doubt and fear. But right then, sitting beside Lyra in the garden, Julian felt like they were finally on the right path. A path they would walk together. Lyra squeezed his hand again and leaned her head against his shoulder. Julian wrapped his arm around her, holding her close as the wind rustled through the trees. They didn't need to speak anymore. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was full of possibility. For the first time in a long time, Julian felt hopeful about the future. It wasn't just about love. It was about healing, about learning to live again, to trust again. They both had scars, both had fears, but they also had each other. And that was enough for now. Together, they would face whatever came next. And for the first time, that thought didn't terrify him. It made him feel ready for whatever the future held. The key lesson from the journey in this narrative is the importance of embracing vulnerability and honesty in our relationships, especially when facing uncertainty and fear. Life often challenges us with difficult decisions, and it's easy to hide behind guilt or fear of what others will think. But the truth is, moving forward requires us to face our emotions head-on, even when they conflict with our past or the expectations of those we care about. In the story, Julian's struggle with his feelings for Lyra and the painful confrontation with Silas reflect the internal battle many of us face, the tension between loyalty to the past and the desire to embrace new opportunities. It's in acknowledging this conflict and allowing ourselves to be honest, both with ourselves and others, that we find clarity. By choosing to act with integrity and openness, we create space for healing and growth, not just for ourselves, but for those we love as well. Life doesn't always follow the neatest path, but facing our truth and stepping forward with courage is the first step toward building meaningful, lasting connections. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to share where you're watching from. And if you want to dive deeper into stories like this one, don't miss our next video, where we explore more of what it means to love, forgive, and live fully, despite the challenges. See you soon.